Welcome. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to be talking about ways to get more from usability testing. Before we jump in, let's just define our terms a little bit. A usability test is a very specific type of user research. It's certainly not the only type of user research you can do, but it's an incredibly important one. Usability testing is what tells us exactly what obstacles we are throwing in the way of our users being successful. And believe me, every day, people using our products are finding obstacles. They're struggling to perform tasks. They're getting lost while looking for information. They're just generally having a hard time using our products. The more usability testing we do, the less often that's going to happen. And interestingly, the earlier we start doing usability testing, the cheaper it is. That's right. Did you know that it can be up to 200 times more expensive to change something after it's already coded than it is to change it in prototype form? I mean, changing a prototype is generally pretty trivial, at least compared with making major changes in production. And remember, that change in production only happens after you found out that there's a problem with your product that's already being used by customers. The most important thing that we can do to ensure that we're doing good user research is to define up front what it is that we want to learn. When we're usability testing, this is what we want to learn. How can I reduce the pain of using my product for a person who wants or needs to attain a specific goal? That's the ultimate point of usability testing. Now let's unpack that a little. First, the goal is to reduce pain. In other words, usability testing isn't about learning about our users or asking people if they'll buy our product or figuring out which new features to add. It's about taking what we have and making it easier for people to use. It's about reducing the pain that we're causing our users every time they open our product. And early prototype testing is about identifying that pain before we inflict it on real people. Let me tell you a little story. So I was talking to a potential client, and it does not matter who it is, because honestly, the story can be told about any of a dozen different companies that I've personally talked to. So the CEO of the company said to me that they had just launched this new version of their product, and they were really worried because the feedback was not good. So I asked what they changed, and the CEO said, it was just a visual redesign of the product, so it looks much cleaner. So I asked, you just changed the visual design then? He said, well, we also changed the way we handle files. Well, it turns out that handling files is the thing that particular product does. It's sort of the entire point of the product. And they just kind of changed the way they did it while doing a visual redesign of the product. I asked if they'd done any usability testing while they were making these major changes. So he said, no, of course they didn't. We didn't have any time. Well, he said, so you have time to go back and fix it all now, because that's what you're going to have to do. And remember that slide where I said that it's a lot cheaper to find problems that you're about to cause, but to find them early rather than waiting until later? Yeah, that. It ended up taking months longer to get the redesign done than it would have if they just caught this major problem early, because they actually had to do the redesign all over again to fix the file handling problem, and they had to completely rebuild all the work that they'd done. Interestingly, the second time through, they actually somehow found the time to do usability testing, and the new version was received much more positively. Now, the second part of our statement talks about a person. Well, of course, your product's for a person, it's not for houseplants. Houseplants have very little budget. But it's not just for any person. In fact, if you think your product is for everybody, you are wrong. Terribly, terribly wrong. Again, I was working with a company, and I asked them who their target user was, and they said moms. So really, is it the mom or this one? She's a mom, kind of famously mom, right? Or is it this one? Because this is an awesome mom. Is your product for all of them? Because I'll bet it isn't. You see, if you were to go out and try to make a product that appeals really a lot to all three of those women, you would fail miserably. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't some product that they might all own eventually. I'm just saying that trying to build something that targets them right out of the gate is really, really, really impossible. So, if your product isn't for everybody, you need to figure out who it is for. And you need to be fairly specific. And you need to usability test it on people who are pretty close to the people that you can go buy it. And that's because if the product's for this lady, but you test it on this lady, you're going to get really bad feedback that's going to send you in entirely the wrong direction. So before you test, make sure that you've specified who your target audience really is by creating a persona. This is a nice example of the kind of personas that I make. Sure, mentions that she's a mom, says right there that she has kids, but it also shows that she's a grandmother. Her kids and grandkids are living far away. Talks about her behaviors and goals, since those are the sort of things that are going to affect what sorts of products she uses. Once you've identified what your key persona is, it makes it much easier to recruit the kind of people who are going to be using your product. And that's important, because this woman is going to have very different problems with the product than Angelina Jolie has. She's going to use products in general differently. She might use a different device to access products. She'll have a different understanding of technology. Generally speaking, if you improve your product for Angelina Jolie, you may end up totally ruining her. It's perfectly misleading. Which brings us to the next key part of what we're learning. What is the specific goal that your product helps its users achieve? The thing about usability testing is, it really only can measure whether users are able to do specific tasks. If you know what your users want to do, you can use usability testing to measure whether or not they're able to do that. Of course, this means that you have to know what sorts of tasks your users are likely to be performing with your product. For example, if you were usability testing something like eBay, you could test whether somebody who already wanted to list a baseball card for sale could do so, or if somebody who wanted to buy a vintage handbag could find one. You couldn't find out if anybody wanted to buy baseball cards or vintage handbags, but given that that's a thing that people want to do and you know that, you can figure out all the ways in which you're making it harder to do those things. And as I've mentioned before, usability testing is a very specific sort of research. It can be incredibly useful, but it's worth talking briefly about what you're not going to learn from this kind of usability testing. For example, it will not tell you whether people will buy your product. The fact that they can accomplish certain tasks that you've defined does not give you any information about whether people will want to perform those tasks in the real world. It's also not going to tell you how people will use your product, if they even do. Since you're giving people tasks to accomplish, it doesn't give you any insight into what they would do if you weren't there directing their every move. And finally, usability testing never tells you whether or not your product solves a problem for anybody. It just tells you whether it's causing problems for people by being too hard to use. To get the most out of your usability test, you're going to need three things. You need the right participants, the right questions or tasks, and the right way of sharing results. If you skimp on any of these things, you're not going to get as much bang for your testing buck. So let's look at how to improve each of those areas. Okay, we've established you're not looking for anybody, and you're not looking for moms, so how do you ensure that you're getting the right participants? Well, you want to take your persona and break it down into the traits that truly matter for what you want to learn. Let's look at an example. Let's say that you're working on a product for doctors in the US who practice a very specific type of medicine. Okay, we know you don't want to test it on accountants, because they're not going to have any idea what you're talking about, because it's all medical stuff. But it's more than just that. Doctors in the US practice very differently than doctors in, say, the UK or Canada. You're going to want to make sure that you're getting the right group of doctors demographically. And doctors who work at large hospitals are going to have different software and hardware needs than doctors who own their own practices. In fact, a doctor that works at Kaiser Permanente might have no say into the kind of software she uses at work. A doctor who runs a small practice might have to spend her evenings doing IT just to keep her office running. Validately, of course, can source candidates for you in certain categories, and if you're a Validately user, I recommend that you check that out. If you want to do your own recruiting for something more specific, social media can be a fabulous way to find specific groups. Once you've got your persona, you can figure out where people like this hang out online and track them there. You're going to find them on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, forums, bulletin boards. All of these can be really useful sources of usability testing participants, but you need to figure out what exact characteristics matter to the use of your product. Of course, once you've got 4 or 5 of these folks who agree to talk to you, you need to ask them the right questions and have them perform the right tasks. Boy, those are easy to get wrong. There are 2 really important keys to good questions and tasks, and they are ask open-ended questions and create clear but not leading tasks. Let's look at some examples. When you're asking questions, ask yourself, could this be answered with a yes or no? If so, find a way to rephrase. So, a bad version of a question might be something like, do you read news on the internet? I mean, for the vast majority of people, the answer to this is going to be yes, right? Yes. I get some news from the internet because I am not Amish, right? But that doesn't tell the whole story, and more to the point, it effectively shuts you off from the whole story. Once you've asked this question, you are limiting your responses to just things relating to internet news. You're not going to hear that they still take the Times because they like doing the crossword on paper. You're not going to hear that they get most of their news from a free alternative weekly. You're not going to hear about anything that you didn't ask specifically. A better version of this question is something like, where do you get your news? Or, even, tell me about the last news story you can remember learning about. Where did you hear about that? This opens you up to a whole universe of interesting stories from the participant, and is far more likely to get you not just the truth, but the whole truth. When you're writing tasks, you need to be clear without being leading. Too often we give the game away in our tasks by telling the participant exactly what they should do, rather than providing them with the sort of information that they would have in normal circumstances. For example, let's say you have a shopping site, and you want to test whether people can find specific things and buy them. It's really tempting to give people very specific instructions. I can't tell you how often I've seen this particular task. Find red pants and add them to a shopping cart, right? But that sort of task isn't going to give you any insight into what a real user would do if she just showed up at your site. Instead, put the user into the situation and let her figure out what she would naturally do. Don't tell her there's a shopping cart. Don't tell her to search. She needs to learn that stuff on her own or find some other way to do it. That's what would happen if you weren't sitting right there next to her, right? Don't give her a specific thing to search for that you know can be found. Let her show you how she normally searches when she comes to the site. Say something like, imagine you'd like to buy a pair of pants for work, and your friends tell you about this product. Show me how you'd use it. You're going to learn far more from the second task than you ever will from the first. And when I talk about user research, there's a single question that I get asked every single time. I'm not exaggerating. I honestly cannot remember a time I didn't get asked this question, and now I am literally just answering the question in all of my talks, and sometimes I still get the question afterwards. I get asked some version of, how do I get other people on my team to understand what I'm doing and get that it's important? The saddest question in the world, because it's basically saying, how do I convince my team that I mean something, that I matter? But it's an important question, because if we aren't sharing this information with our teams, we're not going to have the sort of impact that we need to have as researchers. The answer to this question is complicated, because different teams need different information, but the most convincing thing that I have found is actual video of people failing to use a product. Watching user after user fail at a task is something that even the most hardened skeptic can have trouble ignoring. Watching people struggle with something that we've created can help promote empathy throughout the entire team. And that is incredibly important in getting people to understand prioritization of certain features and changes. I know one engineer who used to call watching the user videos watching hostage videos because they were so incredibly painful to watch. But they're important. Now, Validate makes it very easy to give everybody on your team access to the results of all your usability tests over time and iteration. So, not only can they see where people are failing, they can also see when things have gotten better, or worse, with different changes, and whether certain prototypes perform significantly better than others. I can't tell you how incredibly useful this sort of demonstration is in helping the team to agree about the right direction for the product, and even to show them how much better they're making things when they do make the changes that you suggest. Now, we've been talking about usability testing as if it's exactly one thing, and that's not quite true. You see, there are a few categories of usability testing, and knowing the different versions and what they're good for can be extremely useful. So, task-based usability is what we've been talking about. It's the most common version, and in it you give the participant 3 to 5 different tasks to complete, and then you observe how they do. Do they succeed? Do they fail? Do they take a quick detour before succeeding? If they fail, do they all fail in the same interesting way? How frustrated are they getting? How long does it take them? This is the right kind of testing to do when you know that there are a few very specific tasks that users are likely to do with your product, and you want to make sure it's even possible for them to do them. Like, you've built a to-do list app, and you'll need to make sure that, people can add to-dos and check off to-dos and assign dates to them. Sort of a limited number of things that to-do apps can do. These are things that it's simply not possible to use the product without. You may also want to do this with less used but just as important tasks like password recovery or setting up multiple accounts, looking at you, Google, if that's something that people are likely to struggle with. But another really useful version of testing is the messaging or landing page test. Messaging and landing page tests are they're kind of a specialized version of usability testing that you're probably not doing. They're really fast and lightweight. It's a great tool for understanding whether or not people understand what your product does. How often have you gone to a landing page for a new product, read the text, and thought, yeah, great, but what the hell does this thing do? Messaging tests help you prevent that problem. By testing the messaging on your landing page, or really any part of your product that a user might interact with, you make sure that you're not driving people away just because they don't know what your weird tagline is trying to tell them. And messaging tests are the easiest of all tests to do, since you literally just have to show the landing page to people who are potential users and ask them the question, in your own words, what do you think this product does? And maybe even, what problem do you think this product solves? Finally, there are straight observational usability tests. These are best performed on real users of your current product. In these sessions, you're going to just sit back and observe participants using your product for tasks that they would normally perform. The upside to these kinds of tests is that you get insight not just into the specific tasks that you think you care about, but also into the ways in which your users are really using your product in the real world. A variation on this is the user-defined task. You ask the user, what's the last thing you did with this product? And then you have them recreate what happened. It's a great way to get users into storytelling mode, and it'll help you understand all the bizarre things that people are doing with your product that you probably didn't expect. I know. This all sounds really hard, right? I mean, there are so many things to remember. You're probably wondering how often you have to do this. The real answer is that you should be usability testing whenever you are about to make a change and whenever you make a change. Now, some of you are in a continuous deployment environment. Kudos to you if you are. That means you're making changes every day. Others of you might only make changes once a week, once a month. Sorry if it's once a quarter, but it happens. I worked in an environment once where we shipped code 50 times a day. Honestly, literally. People were shipping stuff out 50 times a day. Obviously, we were not running usability tests before every single commit that would have gotten in the way. But we were running usability tests whenever we made major changes to things that affected user behavior. Shipping a new version of onboarding, prototype test it before building, and observationally test it after launch. Shipping a brand new feature, prototype test it before building, and observationally test it after launch. Making any major change to the user experience? Yeah, you get the pattern. So, we were also using general usability testing and observational usability to identify problems in the product that had developed over time, and to generate ideas for critical things to fix. Often we usability test both branches of an A/B test in order to understand how each version changed user behavior. And of course, we would occasionally usability test our competitors' products to make sure we weren't making any of the same stupid mistakes they were making. We were determined to make our own new, interesting mistakes. The prototype usability testing is critical because it keeps you from getting things wrong that you might otherwise, have problems with. And the post-launch testing is important because it gives you some insight into how people use the feature in the context of your actual product. Many companies institute a 4 on Friday or a 3 on Thursday or whatever on Wednesday, where they just always run a set number of usability tests once a week. The benefit of this is that you never get out of the habit of learning from users, which is a really good thing to just get into your company's DNA. But you don't want to let that replace your more structured testing, where you're testing something specifically that we know that this is a particular thing that's going out and we need to test it now. But programs like this can help you from going too long without doing research, and that's worth doing. And of course, there are some of you who are saying, but I don't have time to do this much testing. Yes, you do have time. Remember the story I told you at the beginning about the company that didn't have time and then had to redo everything? I didn't make that up. I wish I did. I can't even remember which company that specific story is about because I've seen it happen so many times. Remember, research doesn't take time, it saves time. Building a product without doing research is like building a house without looking at blueprints. It's theoretically possible, but you're really likely to have to tear out big chunks of it later and then rebuild it. And that's generally after something's fallen on somebody's head. So the earlier you start doing your usability testing, the fewer problems you're going to have to fix later. So start now. Elliot, we can help.